Good evening, ladies and good evening, class. This is our today is Tuesday, February 25th, 2025, and welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. Today, and welcome to our office hour and lecture at City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. As always, we've just gone past the 5-minute grace period, and we will now begin with the formal part of today's lecture, after which we will switch up the recording and then go into Q&A and office hour. In module 5, we will begin a 3-part study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. These 3 theoretical perspectives include the liberal perspective, the realistic perspective, and historical materialism. This week, we will begin with the liberal perspective. It is obviously helpful to begin with a working definition of the liberal perspective. So the liberal perspective is not without distinctions, and that's one of the first things you might want to note. For instance, liberal economists emphasize the importance of free market and private property and seek to limit the government's role in economic affairs. Of note, liberalism is the most influential perspective in international political economy. Although some liberal economists favor as little government involvement as possible, others believe that some government intervention is necessary for the effective functioning of markets. Simply put, liberal internationalism is a foreign policy doctrine that supports international institutions, open markets, cooperative security, and liberal democracy. Notably, the 3 types of liberal theory of international political economy includes 1. Orthodox liberals. Orthodox liberals believe in negative freedom. That is, the market should be given complete freedom to function. On the other hand, the interventionist and institutional liberals do not believe in negative freedom. They take the view that markets should not be given complete freedom. As I've also mentioned in previous classes, there are some phrases and words that I think it's helpful that the class take note of. And to the extent possible and in context, work these phrases and words into your dialogue, and they suggest a level of understanding, a level of technical understanding of the subject matter. So again, this week is laissez-faire, which is a doctrine opposing governmental interference in economic affairs beyond the minimum necessary for the maintenance of peace and property rights. So the second kind of liberal is the interventionist liberal. And interventionist liberals believe that strong international institutions such as the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank should interfere in the functioning of markets so that equality and justice can be ensured. Institutional liberalism believes government involvement should be there in the functions of the market to ensure equality and justice. By understanding these 3 distinct perspectives, we are able to appreciate the sources of conflict within and among nations regarding trade policies. Furthermore, liberalism revolves around 3 interrelated principles, the first of which is the rejection of power politics as the only possible outcome of international relations. It questions security warfare principles of realism. And we will get to realism, and it's important to take note of today's class in the context of topical events in the news today, be it in the context of the just concluded elections over the weekend in Germany, where pundits believe that some of the issues that animated German voters included immigration and the knock-on effect on perceived effect on security, especially given the number of attacks that happened in the weeks leading up to the election. And of course, as with most nations, inflation and general anxiety over German industrial base. The one thing all this have in common, of course, is to the extent that exposure to global markets creates internal shocks and dislocations, economic and job dislocations within, for instance, in this context, the German economy, and global trade also opening opportunities for international trade so that Germany can increase her exports. Of course, much closer to home, we are also going through a topical period where there are concerns about whether there should be a more direct correlation between United States development assistance and national security and economic interests. And of course, also to the extent that tariffs is an effective mechanism for opening markets and influencing the national decisions that come from foreign governments. So these are all, obviously, tariffs it's really about access to trade. So this is really fairly relevant topics, and we live in a period in history that we're living the reality of our class, that indeed the entire society, both domestic and international, is like a big lab for to interrogate the validity of the subject matter that we cover in class. So without going too far off the reservation, we'll get into the third aspect, which is the third interrelated principle in liberalism, which is mutual benefits and international cooperation. Again, that is that can be the third. This third in a related principle in liberalism can which is the second, of course, which is mutual benefit and international cooperation, could really use to summarize President Macron of France's visit to Washington, D.C. I believe he's still in town. At least he met with the President Trump yesterday, which is trying to stress the mutual benefits in free market principles and international institutions, some of which and all of which we have touched on in this class so far, and the significance of international cooperation. And we also saw that at play yesterday in the General Assembly resolution on the invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, the eventual resolution or statement coming out of the United Nations General Security Council. So we are really observing events, both domestic and international, play out the reality of the topics that we're covering in class. So that could not be a more exciting period to cover global trade and political economy than now. So the third in a related principle in liberalism, of course, is the role of international organizations and non-governmental actors in shaping state preferences and policy choices. The liberal perspective, to continue, emphasizes three factors that encourage more cooperation and less conflict among states. The first of these three factors is international institutions such as the United Nations, which provides a forum to resolve disputes in nonviolent ways. And again, we saw a classic example of this play out yesterday, where the resolution by a majority of the countries at the United Nations, which is called that body within the United Nations, as I mentioned, there are two critical bodies that are able to put out UN resolutions. The first is the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members, of which is the United States, France, United Kingdom, China, and Russia. And each of the 5 members can veto a resolution. And because of that, the Security Council is almost always deadlocked on significant issues of international importance. The other is the General Assembly. While resolutions out of the General Assembly is not binding, it does carry a lot of moral authority. And we saw yesterday this actually play out, where a majority of nations came out and passed a resolution in the General Assembly affirming Ukraine's asserts. And generally speaking, this is not a direct quote, but the spirit of what the resolution was to affirm Ukraine's territorial integrity, affirm Ukraine's right to independence. And a broadly similar measure eventually passed the Security Council. So we really are observing firsthand many of the topics that we cover in class play out in the real world. So again, yesterday was a classic ability of international institutions to take a position of an international issue of significant importance and take a position on those issues in a non-violent way, which is critical to international peace and prosperity. So the second of the 3 factors is international trade, because when countries, economies are interconnected through trade, they are less likely to go to war with each other. Let's unpack this a little bit. When the theory behind international trade is that when countries and their economies are interconnected through trade, they are less likely to go to war with each other. This theory holds largely true. And I'm intentional about saying that this theory holds true for the most part, but not always. And again, going back to the issue of Ukraine, we can see how international trade could actually lead to a security dilemma rather than fostering international peace. And I'll give you a little bit of example of what I mean by that. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the European Union countries were the largest markets for Russian gas and petroleum exports. And petroleum products are some of Russia's biggest exports. It is the linchpin, arguably, of their economy. And roughly 1/3 of the pipeline to transit Russian gas into EU countries, in particular Germany, runs through Ukraine. So there is a pipeline that runs through the territory of Ukraine, and then there are 2 other subsea pipelines called Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. And part of the logic was that Russia would not want to do it because of this integration between the European Union and Russia. And given that a major Russian gas pipeline that supplies Europe, its largest market, runs through Ukraine, Russia was less likely to act in ways that would infringe upon the peace in Ukraine, a major transshipment country, and the European Union, a major market. It does appear that Russia saw that calculation differently. That Russia calculated that the European markets were so beholden to it and so dependent on Russia for its energy supplies that the European markets would not have the leverage or would not want to risk antagonizing Russia if Russia were to move into Ukraine, because Russia had de facto become a single source supplier, de facto single source supplier in significant ways of energy into Europe. It turns out that Russia calculated, as did the European Union, they both miscalculated, in particular, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who really championed trade in energy with Russia as a means to moderate Russia's behavior in Europe. And 3 years later, the war is still ongoing. So I say this to say that that is a good theory and it holds true for the most part. And you can see the peace that exists between United States and Canada as a classic example why interconnected markets are less likely to go into conflict, even as President Trump threatens tariffs against Canada and Mexico. It becomes fairly difficult to even identify what is a Canadian product. You would find out that most products that are going into Canada, many products that go into Canada are indeed finished in the United States, or products that come in from Canada they have input parts and pieces that are produced in the United States. So when you add tariffs to a product that is out of Canada, A, it would create inflationary pressure for us, the consumers of that product. B, it would have, and as inflation, so I don't know how many of us remember Economics 101, elasticity of demand. So when demand is elastic, as the price goes, all things being equal, as the price goes up, demand goes down. So when demand goes down, the producers have to scale back. Oftentimes, scaling back in the long term will require laying off people. And if the people who make the input products of goods that are made out of Canada and supplied in the United States, if the input products are manufactured in the United States, guess who's going to be unemployed? American workers. Guess who's going to be paying the inflationary price of goods because of tariffs? American consumers. So it could almost become cutting your nose to spite your face to place tariffs on your significant major trading partners, especially if your supply chains are integrated. So that is the logic about that. And that the United States and Canada is a classic example to prove the validity of that logic. But to also demonstrate the limitations of that logic, you could examine or interrogate the calculations by the European Union, especially the government of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel in expanding markets with Russia, and Russia's calculation that Europe was so beholden to it for its energy supply that in Europe will be less likely to condemn or take any aggressive measures to counter its invasion of Ukraine. So the third of the three factors that affect the liberal perspective is the spread of democracy, as well as established democracies do not generally go to war with one another. As such, the logic is that if there are more democracies, interstate war will be less frequent. So very quickly, the logic in this, again, is fairly straightforward. In democracies, governments need to be popular. Parties and the governments they produce need to be popular to stay in power. And as the immediate past Senate Majority Leader was once famously said, winners make policy, losers go home. So if you want to make policy, you're going to have to win elections. And the one certain outcome in every war is death and misery. Victory is not assured, but the one thing that is assured is death and misery. And death and misery are typically not recipes for electoral victories. So democratically elected governments have an incentive to try to figure out nonviolent ways to resolve conflicts. Because the uncertainty that comes with war can almost always lead to electoral losses. In the immediate fact, countries have a way of coalescing around their government and showing support in the immediate fact, most often. But as the war wears on, generally speaking, society begins to wonder if there could have been a better way and if a different leadership would have handled the crisis better. And from there, it can quickly become a slippery slope. So the logic is that well-established democracies typically do not go to war with one another. And as such, the logic is that if there are more democracies, interstate peace will be less frequent. Interstate war will be less frequent. Liberals believe that the international institutions play a key role in cooperation among states via interdependence. So the logic is straightforward. One of the ways international institutions can play a key role in cooperation among states is, for instance, the World Trade Organization that we've covered. One of your quizzes, you were asked to interrogate some of the key differences between General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that morphed into World Trade Organization. Of course, one of the significant distinctions is the the more robust conflict resolution mechanism within the WTO. Of course, in addition to protection for intellectual property rights, etc. But one of the key benefits of the transition from GATT to WTO is a more robust dispute resolution mechanism. So that's one of the ways international institutions can foster cooperation among states. Of note, there are three main components of the interdependence, and these include economic, financial, and cultural means. So this interdependence of countries in the liberal order usually have three components. And the three major components are economic, financial, and cultural means. And cultural means is generally what you refer to as soft power. And again, that's one of those phrases that you probably want to write down and have, in your grammar as you discuss global trade and political economy. Soft power, that's the phrase. Significantly, in liberal perspective, security tends not to be the primary goal in state-to-state interactions, and military forces are not typically used. Rather, liberalism argued that international diplomacy can be a very effective way to get states to interact with each other honestly and support nonviolent solutions to problems. With the proper institutions in diplomacy, liberalism takes the view that states can work together to maximize prosperity and minimize conflict. Again, as I say, there could not be a more significant period to take this class than this semester. A couple of weeks ago, we saw the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and an entourage go to the Middle East to meet with a Russian delegation. Realized that, consistent with the liberal perspective, that it was diplomacy that took the lead in the dialogue to work out a peace, to attempt to reach a peace agreement with Russia, a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. It wasn't the DOD, the Department of Defense. It was indeed State Department. So lastly, let me quickly touch on a phrase you may likely have come across, perhaps in your readings, especially for this week's assessment. And that phrase is the Washington Consensus. This, again, is one of those phrases that you need to be aware of, that I need for you to continue to work into your vocabulary as you are have conversations on global trade and political economy, and they really, really have a messaging impact when you use them. So the Washington Consensus is a set of macroeconomic policies widely supported by lenders of intergovernmental organizations, multinational corporations, donor states, and economists. And the Washington Consensus includes one, fiscal discipline, so that countries must maintain, or at least strive to maintain, reasonably balanced budget. Without going too far off the reservation, again, almost always countries maintaining a reasonably balanced budget is a good thing. But remember, one of the key phrases that I mentioned that is helpful that the class become aware of is what's called dialectical thinking. That is seeing an issue from all sides. So with respect to maintaining a balanced budget, we can see that debate ongoing in Germany. Indeed, it was one of the issues that animated the just concluded federal elections in Germany. Elections were held, I think, Saturday or Sunday. I think it was Sunday, actually. One of the major issues was that during that, again, the former Chancellor Angela Merkel's administration, the German government instituted what is called a debt brake. So there's a level of debt that the government may not go beyond. The problem now, though, is that the German economy is stagnating. Europeans, writ large, are getting anxious and wondering if they are no longer able to count on America's military security umbrella. Either way, Europeans, in particular Germany, is calculating that they need to invest significantly more to boost up their ability to defend their country militarily. They're also realizing that they have to invest more in infrastructure so that their economy can function more efficiently. Goods and services and people can more efficiently move within the country. That takes a lot of capital. The third, obviously, is that they also have to invest in R&D, research and development. All these cost money, and it's likely some of this will have to be financed through deficit spending. So there is always, while it's not a good thing to be in debt, there is sometimes a good reason to go into debt. One of which is what many students do, which is take a school loan. So generally speaking, it's probably not a good idea to be in debt, but as an investment, it might be, it is generally almost always worth it to take a loan and go to college than not go to college at all. So again, so I say this to highlight the importance of dialectical thinking in global trade and political economy. So the second factor is public spending focused on economic return. The second part of the Washington Consensus is that you spend on issues that can generate economic return for the country and our economy. So these would include generally education, healthcare, and infrastructure, rather than defense spending or subsidies. So again, defense spending in this case is that, again, it goes back to dialectical thinking. As a rule, investment in defense does not directly grow your economy. Unless, of course, you're calculating that your country may be attacked or invaded, in which case your economy will shut down altogether. So, and if investors are concerned that your country might be invaded, they may be hesitant to engage in any long-term investments in your country. As such, one of the ways to assure the market that it's not likely that your country would be invaded, and in this case, I'm thinking European countries versus Russia, is to build up your defenses so that there's a clear signal to Russia that if you were to try to invade us, you will not win, and you, at the minimum, your nose will be blooded. And once the rational calculation is that if Russia were to understand that, then it's less likely to invade your country, and investors therefore become more amenable to investing in your country long term. So again, there are no black and white areas, but there are some basic fundamentals that you must understand. Then you begin to build in the peculiarities of each individual country, which, by the way, is some of the major criticisms level against IMF, that IMF does not do enough to consider the peculiarities of a country when it encourages countries to engage in fiscal reform. So the next of the Washington Consensus is low taxes. Again, this can be a little bit challenging. The idea of low taxes is that international capital is very mobile. And international capital wants to look at competitive areas to invest in. And if international capital thinks that that corporate tax rate, as one example, is too high, it will just go to your neighbor with a lower tax rate and invest there, and then export the goods and services to your country rather than manufacture them in your country. That's the standard way to look at it. Obviously, you also don't want to start a race to the bottom by having such low tax rates that your neighbor might want to go even lower. And this will begin a race to the bottom on tax rates. The problem with that is obvious. If you don't collect enough taxes, you are not going to be able to fund public service. So you, by necessity, need to create and collect enough taxes to be able to fund public service. So another critical factor in the Washington Consensus is money supply controlled by professionals, not politicians. This is obviously very self-evident. Essentially, you want an independent central bank, not a central bank that takes its instructions from the political class. So ideally, you want exchange rates that are driven by markets. But again, we will go into exchange rates weeks down the road. And again, all things being equal, you want market-driven exchange rates, but there are caveats to that. Number 6 is to open markets to trade and investment. You almost have to do this, but how you go about doing it is just as important. Obviously, if you want to grow, you're going to have to export. If you want to grow your economy, you're going to need to export. And generally, countries might not want you exporting to them if you're not open to taking their imports. So you got to open your market to be able to access international markets, all things being equal. But how you go about opening your market is critical. Sometimes you might want to engage in a level of import substitution, strengthen your domestic production factors, and make them more resilient to international competition before you throw open the gates of global competition. But again, you have to do that in a manner that does not alarm your global trading partners, because otherwise they will place tariffs, as the class has covered, on your exports. And if they place tariffs on your exports, then you're not going to be able to grow your market, because eventually you're going to reach market saturation in your domestic market. And if you can sell overseas, then you got a problem. The 7th of Washington Consensus is deregulate economy and privatize national industries. Again, in theory, this is great. In practice, this is even better. However, there are caveats. Countries have to have strong institutions to be able to manage the competitive nature of privatization of a country's most prized assets. Otherwise, the political class will just buy up the assets. So that's just to think. Or at the minimum, the privatization will be rife with corruption. And you do not want that. The 8th and last part of the Washington Consensus, which is critical, and there is absolutely no caveat, is protection of property rights. If property rights are not protected, countries will be hesitant to invest in the market. And it's not just property rights with respect to real estate, it's intellectual property rights, and it's also an independent judiciary to be able to litigate these issues. So this concludes the formal section of this week's lecture. And you should please kindly note that next week, we will cover the realistic perspective in international political economy. And with that, I'll end the recording and we will transition into the Q&A. Thank you, and let's go. That's not what I want to do. Yeah, this is what I